The radio crackled to life at 11:47 p.m. on October 15, 1991, its static-filled transmission cutting through the humid Louisiana night like a blade through silk. Dispatch operator Maria Santos had been fielding routine calls all evening. Domestic disturbances, minor traffic accidents, the usual collection of small-town emergencies that punctuated the quiet hours in Bayou Ridge, population 4,200. But the voice that came through her headset that night carried an urgency that made her straighten in her chair, her coffee growing cold as she reached for her logbook with trembling fingers.
A Unit 47 to dispatch. I've got a situation out here on Cypress Creek Road. Something's not right. I'm going to need backup, but keep them back until I figure out what we're dealing with.
Officer Daniel Rousseau's voice, normally steady and professional after 8 years of patrolling the backroads and bayous of St. Bernard Parish, carried an edge that Santos had never heard before. There was something in his tone, a mixture of confusion and growing alarm, that made her pulse quicken as she prepared to respond. But before she could key her microphone, the transmission continued.
There's a vehicle here. Looks like it's been abandoned for some time. Louisiana plates, but I can't make out the numbers from this distance. The driver's door is hanging open, and there's something on the ground beside it that I can't quite identify. It's too dark to see clearly, but it looks like clothing, maybe personal effects scattered around. I'm going to approach on foot and investigate.
Those were the last coherent words anyone would hear from Officer Daniel Rousseau for the next 7 years. The silence that followed his transmission stretched across the airwaves like a physical presence, growing heavier with each passing second as Santos repeatedly tried to raise Unit 47 on the radio. Her increasingly frantic calls echoed through the dispatch center, unanswered and ominous, while the digital clock on her console ticked past midnight and into what would become the most haunting mystery in the history of the St. Bernard Parish Sheriff's Department. Daniel Rousseau was not the kind of police officer who simply vanished without explanation. At 34 years old, he was a methodical man who followed protocol with religious devotion, a father of 2 young daughters who called home every night during his shift to say goodnight, and a husband who had never missed a wedding anniversary dinner in 11 years of marriage. His patrol car, Unit 47, was found exactly where his final transmission had indicated, parked on the shoulder of Cypress Creek Road, with its emergency lights still flashing in lazy red and blue circles that painted the surrounding Spanish moss in alternating colors of warning. The abandoned vehicle that Rousseau had reported sat 30 yards ahead of his patrol car, a rusted 1987 Ford pickup with Louisiana plates that traced back to a man named Eugene Thibodeau, who had been reported missing from New Orleans 6 months earlier. But there was no sign of Rousseau himself, no indication of where he had gone after stepping out of his patrol car, no evidence of struggle or violence, no footprints leading away from the scene despite the soft mud that should have preserved any tracks. It was as if Officer Daniel Rousseau had simply dissolved into the thick Louisiana air, leaving behind only questions that would torment his family and colleagues for years to come. The initial search for Rousseau mobilized every available resource in the parish and beyond. Sheriff Robert Landry, who had hired Rousseau straight out of the police academy and considered him one of his most reliable officers, coordinated search teams that combed through hundreds of acres of swampland, abandoned buildings, and rural properties. Bloodhounds followed scent trails that led nowhere. Helicopters with thermal imaging equipment swept across the bayou country for days, and volunteers from neighboring parishes joined the effort to find a missing brother in blue. The mystery deepened when investigators examined the contents of Eugene Thibodeau's abandoned pickup truck. The vehicle's interior had been thoroughly cleaned, but forensic examination revealed trace amounts of blood on the driver's seat and steering wheel, blood that would later be matched to Thibodeau himself through DNA analysis. More disturbing was the discovery of personal items scattered around the truck that Rousseau had mentioned in his final radio call. A woman's purse containing identification for someone named Claire Melançon, who had been reported missing from Baton Rouge 8 months prior, A man's wallet belonging to Marcus Boudreau, missing from Lafayette for over a year. And most chilling of all, a child's backpack with the name Amy Sullivan, written in careful block letters on the ID tag. Amy being a 7-year-old girl who had disappeared from a playground in Métairie 14 months earlier. The abandoned truck had become a collection point for the personal effects of the missing, a mobile trophy case that suggested something far more sinister than random disappearances or coincidental deaths. Someone was using the vehicle to transport evidence of multiple crimes, and Officer Daniel Rousseau had stumbled upon this discovery during what should have been a routine patrol of rural roads. The implications were staggering and terrifying in Rousseau's case when she transferred to the St. Bernard Parish Sheriff's equal measure. Detective Catherine Broussard inherited the department in December 1991, 2 months after the officer's disappearance. At 38 years old, Broussard brought 15 years of experience working homicide cases in New Orleans, along with a reputation for persistence that had earned her both respect and occasional criticism from colleagues who thought she pursued dead-end cases too long. The Rousseau file landed on her desk like a challenge wrapped in a mystery, its contents spread across 3 banker's boxes filled with witness statements, search reports, and forensic analysis that had yielded more questions than answers. Broussard's approach to cold cases differed from her predecessors in crucial ways. Where other investigators had focused on the immediate circumstances of Rousseau's disappearance, she began mapping the connections between the various missing persons whose belongings had been found in Eugene Thibodeau's abandoned truck. Her office wall soon resembled a conspiracy theorist's nightmare, covered with photographs, timelines, and colored string that traced relationships between victims who had vanished across southern Louisiana over an 18-month period. The pattern that emerged was both subtle and horrifying. All of the missing persons had been traveling alone when they disappeared. All had been driving vehicles that were later found abandoned in remote locations, and all had vanished during evening or nighttime hours when rural roads were largely deserted. More significantly, the locations where their vehicles were discovered formed a rough geographical circle centered around the town of Bayou Ridge, suggesting that someone with intimate knowledge of the area was using the isolated road network to hunt for victims. Eugene Thibodeau, whose truck had contained the evidence of multiple disappearances, represented a deviation from the established pattern. Unlike the other victims, Thibodeau had a criminal record that included arrests for assault, theft, and drug possession. His lifestyle and associations placed him in contact with elements of society that the other missing persons had seemingly avoided. Broussard began to suspect that Thibodeau hadn't been a victim at all, but rather someone who had been involved in the disappearances until he himself became a target. The detective's theory gained credibility when she discovered that Thibodeau had been seen in the company of several individuals who would later vanish. Claire Melançon had been spotted talking to a man matching Thibodeau's description at a gas station in Kenner just hours before she disappeared. Marcus Boudreau's co-workers remembered him mentioning a construction job he'd been offered by someone driving a pickup truck similar to the one found on Cypress Creek Road. Even little Amy Sullivan had been seen accepting candy from a man near a truck that fit the same general description, according to witnesses who had been too far away to intervene or get a clear look at the perpetrator's face. The web of connections suggested that Thibodeau had been luring victims to isolated locations, but what had happened to them after they disappeared remained a mystery that consumed Broussard's professional and personal life. She spent weekends driving the back roads of St. Bernard Parish, studying the terrain and looking for locations where bodies might be disposed of in the vast network of swamps, abandoned buildings, and industrial sites that dotted the landscape. Her search was complicated by the fact that Louisiana's wetlands could swallow evidence completely, with alligators and natural decomposition processes eliminating traces of human remains within months or even weeks. The breakthrough in understanding what had happened to the missing persons came from an unexpected source. an environmental survey team that was studying water quality in the bayous surrounding Bayou Ridge. In March 1992, 5 months after Rousseau's disappearance, the survey team was taking soil samples from a marshy area approximately 12 miles from where the officer's patrol car had been found when their equipment detected unusual chemical signatures that indicated the presence of lime, a substance commonly used to accelerate decomposition of organic matter. Further investigation revealed a carefully constructed disposal site, hidden beneath several feet of swamp water and mud. The location had been chosen with expertise that suggested intimate knowledge of both the local geography and forensic investigation techniques. Bodies had been weighted down and treated with chemicals designed to destroy DNA evidence, then placed in areas where natural predators and environmental factors would complete the destruction of human remains. It was a sophisticated operation that had been designed to make victims disappear completely, leaving families with no closure and investigators with no evidence to pursue. The discovery of the disposal site answered some questions about the fate of the missing persons, but it raised even more disturbing possibilities about the scope and duration of the operation. Forensic analysis of the site suggested that it had been in use for at least 2 years, possibly longer, which meant that the number of victims might be far higher than anyone had imagined. If Thibodeau had been operating this disposal site since 1989 or 1990, dozens of missing persons cases from across southern Louisiana might be connected to his activities. The forensic team's excavation of the disposal site required 3 weeks of painstaking work, with specialists from the Louisiana State Police Crime Laboratory working in hazmat suits to carefully sift through layers of decomposed organic matter and chemical residue. What they discovered challenged every assumption investigators had made about the scope of the operation. Bone fragments from at least 11 different individuals were recovered from the site, far more than the 5 missing persons whose belongings had been found in Thibodeau's truck. The implications were staggering. This wasn't just about the handful of disappearances that had been connected to the abandoned vehicle, but potentially dozens of victims whose cases had never been linked together. Detective Broussard stood at the edge of the excavation site on a gray April morning, watching technicians methodically document and catalog each piece of evidence with the clinical precision that major crime scenes demand. The smell of decay and chemical preservatives hung in the humid air like a physical presence, but what disturbed her more than the sensory assault was the realization that they were looking at the work of someone who had perfected their methods through repetition. The placement of remains, the use of chemicals, the selection of the location. Everything indicated a level of expertise that could only come from years of practice. The bone fragments told a story of victims ranging in age from children to elderly adults, representing a cross-section of Louisiana's population that defied easy categorization. Unlike serial killers who typically targeted specific demographics, whoever had been using this disposal site appeared to be an opportunist who selected victims based on availability and vulnerability rather than personal characteristics. This pattern suggested that the operation had been driven by something other than the psychological compulsions that motivated most serial offenders. Perhaps financial gain, human trafficking, or some other criminal enterprise that required the permanent disappearance of inconvenient witnesses. As forensic analysis progressed through the spring and summer of 1992, a clearer picture began to emerge of what had been happening in the rural areas surrounding Bayou Ridge. The operation appeared to have 2 distinct phases: the initial luring and capture of victims, which Thibodeau had likely handled, and the subsequent disposal of remains, which required knowledge and skills that Thibodeau's criminal background didn't suggest he possessed. Someone else had been involved, someone with access to chemicals and equipment, someone who understood forensic investigation well enough to design countermeasures that would destroy evidence and frustrate law enforcement efforts. The search for this unknown partner led Broussard into an investigation that stretched across multiple parishes and involved dozens of law enforcement agencies. She began looking for individuals with the technical knowledge to construct and operate the disposal site, focusing on people with backgrounds in chemistry, medical training, or experience in industries that used lime and other chemicals for processing organic materials. The pool of potential suspects included morticians, medical professionals, agricultural workers, and anyone involved in food processing or waste management. One name that appeared repeatedly in her investigation was Dr. Marcus Hebert, a retired pathologist who had worked for the Orleans Parish Coroner's Office for 23 years before moving to a rural property outside Bayou Ridge in 1989. Hebert's professional background gave him intimate knowledge of human decomposition and forensic techniques, while his rural location placed him in the geographical center of the disposal operation. More suspicious was the timing of his retirement, which coincided closely with the beginning of the disappearances that had been linked to the disposal site. Broussard's surveillance of Hebert revealed a man living in apparent isolation on a 30-acre property that had been converted from a working farm into something resembling a private compound. The property included several outbuildings that had been modified with ventilation systems and chemical storage facilities that seemed excessive for legitimate agricultural purposes. Hebert rarely left his property except for monthly trips to New Orleans, where he visited medical supply companies and chemical distributors, purchasing materials that would be consistent with body disposal operations. The detectives' efforts to build a case against Hebert were complicated by his professional reputation and social standing in the community. During his career with the coroner's office, he had been respected for his thoroughness and attention to detail, testifying in hundreds of criminal cases and earning praise from prosecutors and defense attorneys alike. His retirement had been attributed to health concerns related to decades of exposure to chemicals and biological materials, an explanation that seemed reasonable given the occupational hazards of forensic pathology. Any investigation into his activities would require concrete evidence rather than circumstantial connections and suspicious behavior. The break that Broussard needed came from an unexpected source. A former employee of Heber's who contacted the sheriff's department in August 1992 with information about unusual activities at the property. James Landry, no relation to Sheriff Landry, had worked as a groundskeeper and maintenance worker for Hebert from 1989 to early 1991, leaving his employment after what he described as increasingly disturbing discoveries around the property. Landry had initially dismissed odd smells and unusual chemical deliveries as related to Hebert's medical background, but a combination of guilt and growing suspicion had finally motivated him to contact authorities. Landry's testimony provided crucial details about the operation that investigators had been unable to determine from physical evidence alone. He described late-night deliveries of materials to the property, often coordinated with Thibodeau, who would arrive with pickup trucks or vans that were unloaded in one of the modified outbuildings. The deliveries always occurred when Landry wasn't scheduled to work, but he had witnessed enough to understand that something illegal was happening. More significantly, he had seen Hebert and Thibodeau working together to move heavy containers to vehicles that would then leave the property during the early morning hours. The groundskeeper's account also provided the first concrete timeline for when the partnership between Hebert and Thibodeau had ended. According to Landry, the two men had argued violently in February 1991, with Thibodeau accusing Hebert of cheating him out of money and threatening to expose the operation to authorities. The confrontation had ended with Hebert ordering Thibodeau off the property and warning him never to return. 6 months later, Thibodeau had disappeared, his truck eventually being discovered with the personal effects of multiple victims, evidence that now appeared to have been planted to implicate him in crimes that he had participated in but not orchestrated. The revelation that Thibodeau might have been silenced to prevent him from exposing the operation cast Officer Rousseau's disappearance in an entirely different light. Rather than stumbling upon an abandoned vehicle and vanishing mysteriously, Rousseau had likely discovered evidence that could have led investigators directly to Hebert and the disposal site. His radio transmission describing personal effects scattered around Thibodeau's truck suggested that he had recognized the significance of what he was seeing: multiple victims' belongings in a single location, indicating a pattern of criminal activity rather than an isolated incident. Broussard theorized that Hebert had been monitoring police radio frequencies, a practice that would have allowed him to track law enforcement activities in the area and avoid detection during his disposal operations. When Rousseau's transmission indicated that he had discovered the planted evidence at Thibodeau's truck, Hebert would have realized that his operation was about to be exposed. The 47 minutes between Rousseau's final transmission and the arrival of backup units had provided sufficient time for Hebert to intercept the officer and eliminate him as a potential witness. The detective's working theory gained support when technical analysis of the radio equipment found in Hebert's residence revealed modifications that would have allowed him to monitor multiple law enforcement frequencies simultaneously. The equipment was sophisticated enough to track patrol car locations and predict officer movements, giving him advance warning of any law enforcement presence in areas where he was conducting operations. This technological advantage explained how the disposal site had remained undiscovered for so long, despite intensive searches following each disappearance. Building a prosecutable case against Hebert required more than circumstantial evidence and witness testimony from a former employee who had waited over a year to come forward. Broussard needed physical evidence that directly connected him to the crimes, preferably DNA or fingerprints that could be matched to victims or crime scenes. The challenge was obtaining such evidence without alerting Hebert to the investigation, which could prompt him to destroy remaining evidence or flee the jurisdiction before charges could be filed. The opportunity to gather definitive evidence came in September 1992, when Hebert's medical condition required him to undergo surgery at a New Orleans hospital. The procedure would keep him hospitalized for several days, providing investigators with an opportunity to search his property without the risk of confrontation or evidence destruction. Sheriff Landry obtained search warrants for the residence and outbuildings, coordinating with state and federal agencies to ensure that the search would be thorough enough to uncover any evidence that Hebert might have hidden. The search of Hebert's property revealed a level of criminal sophistication that shocked even experienced investigators. Hidden compartments in the outbuildings contained detailed records of victims, including photographs, personal information, and what appeared to be financial transactions related to their disappearances. The documentation suggested that the operation had been far more extensive than anyone had imagined, with victims being selected not just for opportunity but for specific characteristics that made them valuable to unknown buyers or clients. The financial records discovered in Hebert's hidden compartments painted a picture of an operation that generated substantial income through methods that investigators were only beginning to understand. Bank statements showed regular deposits of large sums of cash, often coinciding with the dates when victims had disappeared. The amounts varied dramatically. Some entries showed payments of a few $1,000s, while others documented transactions exceeding $50,000. The pattern suggested that different victims had different values to whoever was purchasing them, though the criteria for these valuations remained mysterious. Detective Broussard spent hours poring over the financial documentation, trying to decode the system that Hebert had used to track his criminal enterprise. Each victim had been assigned a number rather than being identified by name, and the records included detailed physical descriptions, medical information, and what appeared to be quality assessments that determined their ultimate fate. The clinical language used in these documents was perhaps the most disturbing aspect of the discovery. Human beings reduced to inventory items with market values based on characteristics that the detective couldn't bring herself to fully comprehend. The photographs, found alongside the financial records, provided visual confirmation of what the disposal site excavation had suggested. Dozens of individuals, ranging in age from young children to elderly adults, had been documented with the same methodical precision that Hebert had once applied to his legitimate forensic work. The images showed victims in various states of consciousness and distress, some appearing to be unaware they were being photographed, while others displayed clear signs of terror and desperation. The photographs were organized chronologically, creating a timeline of criminal activity that stretched back nearly 4 years. More chilling than the victim documentation were the correspondence files that revealed the scope of Hebert's criminal network. Letters and notes indicated that he had been in regular contact with individuals across the southeastern United States, coordinating shipments and discussing specifications for particular types of victims. The language used in this correspondence was coded, but transparent enough for investigators to understand that they were looking at evidence of human trafficking on a scale that dwarfed anything previously prosecuted in Louisiana. The network appeared to operate with the efficiency of a legitimate business, complete with quality control measures, delivery schedules, and customer service protocols. Hebert served as both a supplier and a disposal specialist, acquiring victims through his partnership with Thibodeau, while also providing body disposal services for other criminal organizations. The dual nature of his operation explained the sophistication of the disposal site and the careful documentation of each transaction. He was running multiple criminal enterprises simultaneously. Among the correspondence, investigators found references to a client identified only as the collector, who appeared to be Hebert's most lucrative customer. This individual or organization had specific requirements for victims and was willing to pay premium prices for subjects who met particular criteria. The communications suggested that the collector was located somewhere in the Florida Panhandle and had been conducting business with Hebert since 1989, making them potentially responsible for dozens of disappearances across the region. The search also uncovered evidence that directly connected Hebert to Officer Rousseau's disappearance. Hidden in a floor safe beneath Hebert's bedroom were personal items that belonged to the missing officer: his service weapon, badge, and wallet, along with the keys to Unit 47. More significantly, investigators found Rousseau's patrol car radio, which had been removed from the vehicle and modified with recording equipment that would have allowed Hebert to document the officer's final transmissions. The presence of these items eliminated any possibility that Rousseau had simply abandoned his duties or met with an accident. The forensic analysis of Rousseau's personal effects revealed trace evidence that confirmed investigators' worst fears. DNA analysis found genetic material from multiple individuals on the officer's badge and weapon, suggesting that he had not died quickly or quietly. The pattern of evidence indicated that Rousseau had been tortured for information about police procedures and investigation techniques before being killed. Hebert's medical background had given him the knowledge necessary to extract information through methods that would have been both prolonged and excruciating. The discovery of Rousseau's radio equipment led to another disturbing revelation about the scope of Hebert's operation. Technical analysis showed that the device had been used to monitor law enforcement communications for months before the officer's disappearance, allowing Hebert to track patrol patterns and avoid areas where police presence was likely. The equipment had also been modified to broadcast false emergency calls, potentially luring other officers into dangerous situations where they could be captured or eliminated if they threatened the operation. Sheriff Landry coordinated with federal authorities to ensure that Hebert's arrest would occur before he could be discharged from the hospital and potentially flee the jurisdiction. The charges filed against him included multiple counts of first-degree murder, kidnapping, human trafficking, and conspiracy to commit murder, charges that carried the possibility of the death penalty under Louisiana law. The complexity of the case required the involvement of FBI specialists in organized crime and human trafficking, transforming what had begun as a missing person investigation into one of the largest federal prosecutions in the state's history. The arrest warrant for Hebert was served at Charity Hospital in New Orleans on September 18, 1992, nearly 11 months after Officer Rousseau's disappearance. Despite his weakened condition following surgery, Hebert maintained his composure when informed of the charges against him, showing no surprise or emotional reaction to the accusations. His only response was a request for legal representation and a statement that he would not be making any admissions without counsel present. The calm demeanor that had served him well during his legitimate medical career now worked to his advantage as he faced the most serious criminal charges possible under state and federal law. The investigation into Hebert's criminal network expanded rapidly following his arrest, with law enforcement agencies across the Southeast coordinating efforts to identify and apprehend his associates. The correspondence found at his property provided leads that stretched from Texas to Georgia, involving individuals who had purchased victims or provided logistical support for the trafficking operation. Each new arrest generated additional evidence and witness testimony that further illuminated the scope of the criminal enterprise. The search for the collector became a priority for federal investigators, who recognized that this individual or organization represented the primary market for Hebert's victims. Financial analysis suggested that the collector had paid over $2 million for victims over the course of their relationship with Hebert, making them one of the largest purchasers of trafficked humans in the region. The specific requirements that the collector had communicated to Hebert suggested purposes for the victims that investigators preferred not to contemplate too deeply. Tracing the financial transactions that connected Hebert to the collector proved challenging due to the use of cryptocurrency and offshore banking arrangements that were designed to obscure the trail of payments. Federal financial crimes specialists worked for months to penetrate the layers of legal and illegal financial instruments that had been used to fund the operation. The complexity of the money laundering scheme suggested that the collector had access to sophisticated financial and legal advice, indicating resources and connections that extended far beyond typical criminal organizations. The breakthrough in identifying the collector came from an unexpected source: a former victim who had escaped from a facility in Florida and made contact with authorities there. The woman, who had been missing from Alabama for over 2 years, provided detailed testimony about a compound near Pensacola, where dozens of trafficked individuals were being held for purposes that she described only as medical experiments. Her description of the facility and its operators matched details found in Hebert's correspondence with the collector, providing the first concrete lead in locating the primary destination for his victims. The federal raid on the Florida compound in November 1992 resulted in the rescue of 37 victims and the arrest of 6 individuals who had been operating what investigators described as a private medical research facility that conducted illegal human experimentation. The facility had been purchasing subjects from traffickers like Hebert for use in drug trials, surgical procedures, and other medical research that would have been impossible to conduct legally. The victims found at the compound had been subjected to treatments that violated every principle of medical ethics and human rights. The connection between Hebert's trafficking operation and the illegal medical facility explained the specific requirements that the collector had communicated for victims. Age, health status, and other physical characteristics had been important because they affected the subject's suitability for particular types of experimentation. The financial records showed that healthy young adults commanded the highest prices, while children and elderly victims were valued for different types of research. The clinical language used in the correspondence now made horrifying sense. Human beings had been reduced to laboratory specimens with market values based on their research potential. The arrests in Florida generated additional evidence that further implicated Hebert and revealed the full scope of his criminal activities. Financial records seized from the compound showed payments to multiple suppliers across the Southeast. indicating that Hebert had been just one source in a larger network of human traffickers serving the illegal medical research industry. The scale of the operation dwarfed anything that law enforcement had previously encountered, with hundreds of victims potentially involved across multiple states and several years of operation. The testimonies from the Florida compound victims provided investigators with the first detailed accounts of what had happened to the people who had vanished from rural Louisiana roads. Sarah Mitchell, a 24-year-old nursing student who had been missing from Mobile, Alabama for 18 months, described a journey that began with engine trouble on a dark highway and ended in a sterile medical facility where she had become an unwilling test subject for experimental psychiatric medications. Her account matched perfectly with the timeline and methods documented in Hebert's records, confirming that the trafficking operation had been systematically targeting travelers who could disappear without immediate investigation. The victims' statements revealed a sophisticated system of capture and transport that had operated with military precision across multiple states. Hebert and his associates had identified vulnerable individuals through careful surveillance of rest stops, gas stations, and rural highways where travelers might experience mechanical problems or become stranded. The operation employed multiple teams of spotters who would report potential targets to capture crews equipped with vehicles designed to simulate legitimate emergency services or roadside assistance. Detective Broussard interviewed Sarah Mitchell personally, flying to Florida to document her testimony about the methods used to select and acquire victims. Mitchell's account was particularly valuable because she had remained conscious during much of her transport from Alabama to Florida, providing details about the logistics that other victims had missed due to sedation or the trauma. She described being approached by someone identifying himself as a state trooper who offered assistance with her disabled vehicle, only to be drugged and awakened days later in a medical facility that bore no resemblance to any legitimate hospital. The sophistication of the operation became clear as more victims provided statements about their experiences. The traffickers had invested heavily in equipment and training that allowed them to impersonate law enforcement officers, emergency medical technicians, and other authority figures who could approach stranded motorists without raising suspicion. Their vehicles were equipped with authentic-looking emergency lights, radios, and medical equipment that would pass casual inspection by anyone unfamiliar with genuine emergency services protocols. Mitchell's description of the medical facility revealed an operation that had been designed to maximize research productivity while minimizing the risk of discovery. The compound was located on private property that had been zoned for agricultural use, allowing it to operate without the regulatory oversight that would apply to legitimate medical facilities. The buildings were constructed to contain sound and prevent escape attempts, while sophisticated air filtration systems ensured that any chemical or biological hazards remained contained within the facility boundaries. The illegal medical experiments conducted at the compound represented violations of every principle established by the Nuremberg Code and subsequent international agreements governing human research. Victims were subjected to untested pharmaceutical compounds, surgical procedures performed without proper anesthesia, and psychological experiments designed to break down mental resistance to further abuse. The research was conducted without any oversight or ethical review, with subjects treated as disposable resources rather than human beings with rights and dignity. Financial records from the compound revealed that the illegal research was being funded by legitimate pharmaceutical companies who were using the facility to conduct preliminary testing of drugs that had failed to gain approval for human trials through legal channels. The arrangement allowed these companies to gather data on human subjects without the expense and regulatory burden of conducting proper clinical trials. The moral and legal implications of this corporate involvement added another layer of complexity to the prosecution of the trafficking network. The investigation expanded to include federal agencies specializing in corporate crime and regulatory violations, as evidence suggested that several major pharmaceutical companies had knowingly participated in the illegal research program. corporate executives had visited the facility, reviewed research data, and made financial decisions based on information that could only have been obtained through illegal human experimentation. The paper trail connecting these legitimate businesses to the trafficking operation provided prosecutors with leverage that would eventually lead to plea agreements and cooperation in dismantling the entire network. Dr. Marcus Heber's trial began in March 1993, 6 months after his arrest, and 18 months after Officer Daniel Rousseau's disappearance. The case attracted national media attention due to the scope of the criminal enterprise and the involvement of legitimate businesses in funding illegal human experimentation. The courtroom was packed daily with family members of victims, law enforcement officers, and journalists who recognized that this case represented something unprecedented in the annals of American criminal justice. Prosecutor Jennifer Cormier built her case methodically, presenting evidence that documented every aspect of Heber's criminal activities from the initial planning stages through the disposal of victims who had died during the illegal medical experiments. The financial records, victim testimony, and physical evidence created a comprehensive picture of an operation that had generated millions of dollars in profit while destroying dozens of lives across multiple states. The clinical precision with which Heber had documented his crimes provided prosecutors with evidence that would have been impossible to fabricate or misinterpret. The defense strategy focused on challenging the chain of custody for evidence and questioning the reliability of victim testimony from individuals who had been subjected to experimental psychiatric medications. Heber's attorneys argued that their client had been a legitimate medical professional who had been manipulated by more sophisticated criminals into providing services that he believed were legal. They portrayed him as a victim of corporate exploitation rather than the mastermind of a trafficking operation, despite overwhelming evidence to the contrary. The testimony of James Landry, the former groundskeeper, proved crucial in establishing Heber's central role in planning and coordinating the criminal activities. Landry's detailed knowledge of the property modifications, chemical deliveries, and late-night activities provided context that helped jurors understand how the operation had functioned on a day-to-day basis. His account of the violent confrontation between Heber and Thibodeau supported the prosecution's theory that Heber had eliminated his partner to prevent exposure of the trafficking network. Sarah Mitchell's testimony was perhaps the most powerful moment of the trial, as she described her 18 months of captivity and the medical procedures she had endured without consent or proper medical care. Her detailed account of the facility's operations, the staff members who had conducted experiments on her, and the conditions under which victims were held, provided jurors with a human face for the crimes that had been reduced to financial transactions and clinical documentation in Heber's records. The prosecution's case was strengthened by testimony from FBI agents who had investigated similar trafficking operations in other states, establishing that Heber's network was part of a larger criminal enterprise that had been operating across the southeastern United States for several years. The agents described connections between the Louisiana operation and similar facilities in Georgia, Alabama, and Mississippi, suggesting that the illegal medical research industry had developed into a sophisticated network that supplied subjects to multiple research facilities. The discovery of Officer Rousseau's remains during the trial's second week provided the emotional climax that prosecutors needed to ensure conviction on the most serious charges. A road construction crew working near Heber's property had uncovered skeletal remains that were positively identified through dental records as belonging to the missing police officer. The condition of the remains and their location confirmed that Rousseau had been tortured and killed to prevent him from exposing the trafficking operation, making his murder particularly heinous in the eyes of the jury. Forensic analysis of Rousseau's remains revealed evidence of prolonged torture that corroborated the prosecution's theory about how he had died. The officer's medical knowledge and law enforcement training had made him a valuable source of information about police procedures and investigation techniques, leading Hebert to keep him alive for weeks while extracting information that would help the trafficking operation avoid detection. The brutality of Rousseau's final days provided prosecutors with aggravating factors that would justify seeking the death penalty. The trial's conclusion in May 1993 resulted in guilty verdicts on all counts, including first-degree murder, kidnapping, human trafficking, and conspiracy charges that carried mandatory life sentences under Louisiana law. The jury deliberated for less than 6 hours before returning verdicts that ensured Hebert would never again be free to harm innocent people. The speed of the deliberation reflected the overwhelming nature of the evidence and the jurors' revulsion at the scope of the crimes that had been documented during the 3-month trial. Hebert's sentencing hearing provided family members of victims with an opportunity to address the court about the impact his crimes had on their lives. Daniel Rousseau's widow, Marie, delivered a statement that reduced the courtroom to silence as she described the 18 months of uncertainty and fear that had preceded the discovery of her husband's remains. Her words captured the particular cruelty of crimes that rob families of closure while forcing them to imagine the worst possible scenarios about their loved ones' final days. The sentences imposed on Hebert included multiple life terms without the possibility of parole, ensuring that he would die in prison regardless of any future legal challenges or appeals. Judge Patricia Melanson described the crimes as representing a level of evil that challenged the capacity of the criminal justice system to provide adequate punishment, noting that no sentence could truly account for the suffering that Hebert had inflicted on his victims and their families. The investigation continued even after Hebert's conviction, as law enforcement agencies worked to identify and prosecute his associates throughout the trafficking network. The pharmaceutical companies that had funded the illegal research faced federal charges and civil lawsuits that resulted in hundreds of millions of dollars in fines and settlements. The corporate executives who had knowingly participated in the scheme received prison sentences that sent a clear message about the consequences of exploiting vulnerable people for profit. The case transformed how law enforcement agencies approached missing persons investigations, particularly those involving individuals who disappeared while traveling through rural areas. The recognition that traffickers were systematically targeting vulnerable travelers led to improved coordination between agencies and the development of new protocols for investigating disappearances that might be connected to organized criminal activities. The lessons learned from the Rousseau case influenced training programs and investigative procedures that are still used today. Detective Catherine Broussard received national recognition for her work on the case, but she found little satisfaction in the accolades that followed the successful prosecution. The scope of the crimes and the suffering of the victims had left emotional scars that would never fully heal, despite the knowledge that justice had been served and the trafficking network had been dismantled. She continued working cold cases for another 15 years before retiring, always carrying the memory of the victims whose stories she had helped bring to light. The rural roads around Bayou Ridge returned to their normal quiet after the trial concluded, but residents never forgot the revelation that such evil had operated in their midst for years without detection. The case became part of local folklore, a cautionary tale about the dangers that could lurk behind familiar faces and trusted institutions. Parents became more protective of their children. Travelers became more cautious about accepting help from strangers, and the community learned that vigilance was the price of safety in a world where predators could hide behind respectable facades. The pharmaceutical companies involved in funding the illegal research faced congressional investigations and regulatory reforms that transformed how clinical trials are conducted and monitored. The revelation that legitimate businesses had participated in human trafficking shocked the medical community and led to stricter oversight of research activities, particularly those conducted outside traditional academic and hospital settings. The corporate accountability measures that resulted from the case provided some measure of justice for victims whose suffering had been commodified for profit. The Florida compound was eventually demolished after serving as evidence in multiple trials, but its legacy lived on in the form of improved victim services and support programs for trafficking survivors. Sarah Mitchell and other victims who testified during the various prosecutions became advocates for stronger laws and better protection for vulnerable populations who might be targeted by similar criminal enterprises. Their courage in speaking publicly about their experiences helped other survivors come forward and seek the help they needed to rebuild their lives. 7 years after Officer Daniel Rousseau's radio had crackled to life with his final transmission, the mystery of his disappearance had been solved in ways that no one could have anticipated. What had begun as a routine patrol had uncovered a criminal enterprise of staggering scope and brutality, leading to prosecutions that dismantled an entire network of traffickers and illegal researchers. The price of that discovery had been paid by Rousseau himself and dozens of other victims whose lives were destroyed by the greed and callousness of individuals who viewed human beings as commodities to be bought and sold. The case files that documented the investigation filled an entire room at the St. Bernard Parish Sheriff's Department, serving as a permanent reminder of what had been uncovered through the dedicated work of investigators who refused to accept that people could simply vanish without explanation. The evidence preserved in those files continued to generate new leads and investigations years after the primary prosecutions concluded, as law enforcement agencies worked to identify additional victims and ensure that every aspect of the criminal network had been exposed and dismantled. The Rousseau case stands as a stark reminder that evil often wears the most ordinary faces, hiding behind professional credentials and community respectability while orchestrating horrors that defy comprehension. 7 years of uncertainty ended with revelations that were far more disturbing than anyone could have imagined. A single officer's final radio call had exposed a network of human trafficking and illegal experimentation that stretched across multiple states and claimed dozens of lives. Today, the rural roads around Bayou Ridge remain quiet, but the lessons learned from that October night in 1991 continue to influence how law enforcement approaches missing persons cases, ensuring that no disappearance is dismissed as coincidence when the truth might be far more sinister.